Okay, good evening. Welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources to hopefully help improve your life. I'm Stu Reid. I'm here with my co-host, Dave Burstein. Hey, Dave.
Hello.
How you doing?
Not too bad. I put together some news stuff, and I thought I wanted to experiment with opening with some news.
Okay.
Is that going to work out?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. The first set of stories are really disappointing. The Biden administration has plans for broadband and networks that are going to be mostly useless and wasteful and aren't going to solve the real problems.
Wow.
Wish it were otherwise. They're not stupid people, but they're in the Washington fog. The key thing that's coming down is that they're not going to solve the biggest problem for U.S. networks and for getting the rest of us connected. The fact that we have some of the highest prices in the world. In fact, the former FCC chair, Jules Janikowski, thinks broadband prices will not be regulated, and we probably will not see any significant drop when we're twice the price, for example, as France. Ugly.
Yeah.
But,
so Dave, where is Biden? Where is his administration looking to focus their spending? I think I heard something like $20 billion. Is that accurate?
Yeah, they're going to focus it on wasting it and giving it away to the companies. That's a horrible thing to say, but it's exactly what happened when we had $7 billion in the broadband stimulus in 2010. And it looks no better this time because they're getting it all wrong. Biden talked to the Times interview this morning, and he said we should spend $20 billion. We need to bring broadband to rural areas. Reality: there are very few rural areas that don't have broadband. He said rural hospitals need to be connected. Reality: $1 billion worth of telehealth spending the last 5 years has gone to connecting rural hospitals and the like. Detail: 95% of the kids that are not connected, and we're going to have an interesting show today about connecting New York City kids, can already get service because they are reached by wired and wireless networks. At most, 5% of the problem is where they want to spend the money, getting to the amazingly few rural areas that don't have any choices yet.
Yeah, the 95%, Dave, let me just be clear. The 95% is 95% availability for many of the folks that don't have it. Is that not right?
95%, according to a reputable study I'm writing up, of the kids who aren't connected could get it in the next couple of weeks or at most months because the networks are already there and ready to go. T-Mobile is willing to connect 10 million for free. That's almost all of them. And Comcast is already connecting all of Chicago and ready for much more. We've talked about that on the show before. There's absolute idiocy to concentrate on the 3% or so that they want to spend $20 or $50 billion on, because they have no idea what the networks really are. Painful.
That's so disappointing. I want to talk about a few more news items, but we just not be rude and introduce our guest, Dave. She's the supervising attorney of the Education Law Project at Legal Aid. She's a graduate of Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law and has worked with Legal Aid for nearly 2 decades, specializing on educational rights of students with disabilities who are living in poverty. I'm pleased to welcome Susan Horwitz to Community and Technology. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sure.
And one small correction, I just had my 30-year anniversary at
Whoa.
Legal Aid. So, yeah.
Wow.
I am what we call a Legal Aid lifer.
Okay.
And happily so.
Good, good, good. Well, Dave and I are just talking about a few news items, and we're going to segue to the stuff that you're doing in just a moment.
Great.
I just wanted to finish up with Dave. Dave, you're talking about the Biden administration is looking like they're going to misspend some $20 billion on rural broadband, when in fact it is
It's
available.
not being spent on rural broadband. It's been pretending to deliver rural broadband, but mostly being wasted along the way. That's the horrible reality of what happened to $7 billion of the broadband stimulus in 2010 that was supposed to connect these same handful of unserved rural.
And urban for that particular.
There weren't any unserved urban by then. Cable has 92%.
What are you talking about? New York City has several 100,000 unserved people still to this day.
They're served. They don't have the money to buy it. Is the problem? That's where it goes.
Well,
the networks are there.
Availability versus accessibility, and there's a big difference.
Right, and they're spending all their money supposedly on bringing availability that's already there and ignoring the 95% of the unserved kids who could be served right away, literally within weeks, maybe months, by T-Mobile and Comcast and Charter and all the others who have active programs to get the kids connected so inexpensively it would be a quarter of the year's universal service budget to cover 90% of the unserved kids. That's a total failure of government. And we're going to hear about another failure of government, I believe, from our guest.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue to Ms. Horwitz. Tell us about your work with the legal aid and what's been going on with broadband and the lack thereof for so many folks.
Sure. So, in general, my work in legal aid for the past 15 years or so has been working on education issues for low-income kids in New York City. And, obviously, when the schools closed down due to the COVID outbreak, we immediately became concerned about how kids were going to get connected to remote learning when they don't have technology. So as a baseline, the concern was just getting connected. And then, moving on from there, we have been dealing with things like kids with disabilities who should be receiving special education services, some of which really can't be done remotely, but some of which can, with some fidelity, and sort of, looking at all of the different ways in which the tentacles of lack of walking into a physical schoolroom affect kids with varying needs. So very early on, as as many people have read, the New York City Department of Education decided that the best way to get everybody connected who did not have access was to buy hundreds of thousands of cell-enabled iPads and then contract with T-Mobile to do, I think that the total cost was a $10 a month plan, very reasonable, to get kids who didn't have any other options the ability to access the internet, to get online for their, for a long time. They were using Zoom for classes. Then there was a security problem with Zoom, so they switched to Google Meet, and then Zoom fixed it. And so I think that there are still some different platforms being used, but primarily it has been going to school through Zoom. So, we absolutely have always acknowledged at Legal Aid and with the communities that we work with that the city initially did a fantastic job of distributing all of these iPads to kids, and they prioritized kids who were living in shelters, kids with disabilities, and kids in foster care placements. And so they really, they looked at the right groups when they decided which kids were going to get these devices first. So overall, great interim idea, good execution in terms of the distribution, but the problem was T-Mobile service throughout New York City is not really so great. So from the very beginning, we started getting calls, and when we would do outreach to our clients just to check that everyone had gotten a device, had adequate instructions and information on how to connect and how to navigate the different apps, because we also there are lots of folks who have low digital literacy who really needed a lot of assistance with learning how to navigate the apps. And in addition, as one aside, instructions were sent home at various times. I'm not sure whether it was by mail or by email, but we had lots of non-English speakers who did not get instructions, parents who did not get instructions on how to use the iPads in their own language. So it's another sort of barrier. But really, overall, great job with distributing. The problem is when problems arose, which for our families was pretty much immediately, with the reliability of the connection, it was extremely difficult to get any help. The city and DOE at various times, they had a technical support number. Sometimes there was somebody answering it. My suspicion is that from the beginning, that tech support line was just absolutely overwhelmed. We had a number of families where the device just clearly wasn't working at all. And so DOE would send somebody to swap it. And, in light of how careful everyone was trying to be at the beginning, we were grateful that there was some actual, in-person visits to try to help families. But what happened throughout the spring was that we started seeing this pattern among kids living in shelters, lots of different shelters, where the cell signal just was not reliable enough to be able to be online.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really where this whole issue began for us. In the lawsuit, we brought it as a class action, and we have 3 families who are our main 3 named plaintiffs. But another one of our clients is the Coalition for the Homeless, because they are, the biggest homeless service agency in the city and work with such a huge number of families and homeless individuals. And they actually run enrichment programs at a couple of the shelters in the city. And they really were able to immediately identify this as a problem because they were still going into the shelters to see kids during the after school hours.
Susan, let me just clarify, just for my own and for our audience. The iPads that the city distributed had connectivity built in for the T-Mobile cell phone network. Is that correct?
Right.
And that's where the problems were in terms of not being robust enough for many families, and in particular the families in the shelters that you're talking about. Is that correct?
That's correct. And it was interesting when we would there was a method for advocates and lawyers to kind of escalate some of these issues to specific people within the Department of Ed. And they seem to understand very well the difference between a cell signal and what everyone is referring to as Wi-Fi, meaning a network based on a wired signal. DOE understood that, but in our conversations with the Department of Homeless Services and other folks in the city, it was a bear to be really clear about what that difference is, because we would get responses like, but everybody has Wi-Fi. They have their iPads. And we'd say, do you see that phone in your hand? Go take the phone in your bathroom. How many bars do you have?
Mm-hmm.
And so one way that I have been thinking about why this is so inappropriate to rely just on a cell signal is to basically say, we've got kids going to school via iPhone. And, if they were lucky enough, if for lots of our kids who didn't have a signal, they could either rely on a parent's hotspot on a phone until the parent ran out of data and didn't have the money to pay for more. We had a couple of kids who we knew who were sort of sitting in the window because they could pull in a Wi-Fi signal from a hotspot from a business. We talked with families who would go out and take the iPad to one of the NYC Link kiosks for just long enough to be able to download homework. You know, it was these kinds of issues where school cannot be conditioned on having a good cell signal. As I said, having enough bars.
Wow.
So yeah.
You know,
Obviously this makes sense to you, being sort of in the world, but trying to explain why that's really not okay to folks who haven't really thought deeply about sort of the digital divide and equity and access to the internet. It's been a bit of a push.
Yeah, I want to bring Dave into the conversation because he's done a lot of research. He's a technology journalist and has followed the wireless industry for several decades. And in particular, I know that Dave, you've talked about T-Mobile's network, and I thought their network was more robust than what I'm hearing from Susan. What's been your experience with them, Dave? If you can unmute yourself and chime in. Susan, were any metrics done in terms of looking at the actual upload and download speeds on the T-Mobile network? Do you have any actual data points?
I don't have specific data points, but what I do know is that, we started raising this as an issue in April. And finally, at the end of August, the city and T-Mobile, made a date for T-Mobile to go and assess the signal at one of the main locations in Brooklyn that we had been getting the most complaints about. And their sense was, I admittedly, I did see pictures of some of the maps and I had no idea what they meant because I'm not quite that technical about this. I'm the armchair techie. But what they had said was that the signal was fine, upload and download speed was fine. They tweaked a tower and they did some sort of boost and everything should be fine. But possibly because of the structure of the building, it still wasn't coming in. And so what they did ultimately in that shelter was they switched to Verizon, and that resolved the issue for the time being. But still, it just feels like relying on a cell signal is not going to be as reliable as the wired service.
Okay, we're speaking with Susan Horwitz from the Legal Aid about lack of internet access for many school children. And this is WHCR 90.3 FM. And Dave, I wanted you to chime in. I know you've looked at what T-Mobile has been doing. I see a lot of a big marketing push from them about their 5G. How does what square with what we're hearing from Susan about the on-the-ground experience with school kids?
Mobile networks aren't perfect. That's why I say that 70–80% of the kids can be connected very quickly because they're going to work in the network. And there are going to be some problems in some buildings on any mobile network. But Susan knows what the solution is for this, which is get the Wi-Fi working inside the shelter. And that's something that the city should have done right away because it's easy and not very expensive and protects the probably relatively small minority of kids who aren't getting a decent cell signal. And they have to be protected. So why didn't the city just plug in Wi-Fi? And Stu, before we leave the air, you should talk about what that takes and how you could do it in a few weeks in a building like a shelter, and make that happen.
It's
if you had a team.
If you had a team, you could do it in a couple of days. You get your network feed from wherever the source is coming from, whether it's wired or a high capacity wireless signal into the facility. And then you distribute that signal to your hotspot access points located throughout the facility. A day, 2 days, and it's done.
It's so gratifying to hear you say this because, that has been our whole case is about, we will not accept that you're telling us it's going to take you until next summer to get all these buildings done.
That's
And
Are they really that incompetent? I can make 3 phone calls and have it happen in almost any building in New York in weeks.
so
Let me be precise about that. Stu's the expert on community networks. He's been building them for 20 years. That's why I asked him to talk about putting in the Wi-Fi. It might not be a day or two. You might have to wait to get some equipment in or something. But it's weeks, not
and
6 months.
Their position has been, we're talking about over 200 buildings with all different kinds of construction. Some of them are going to be easy. Some of them we're going to have to go into the walls and wire everything and add cables and go inside and blah, 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 blah.
But Stu's been doing this for 20 years, and he's the guy who says you could do it in days usually. And I can confirm that from what I know. And you can get the signal into the building by putting an antenna or the roof and calling any of about 6 outfits in New York, active commercially, who will hook up that antenna, for example, to their antenna on the Empire State Building and have you get the building connected in days, and then you go in and wire it. And yeah, there's some problems. It will only be 90 or 95% in a matter of weeks, or some incompetence in city negotiating and contracting. But technically, this is the stuff that people like Stu and hundreds of New York City commercial outfits are doing within weeks all the time. I could get it set up with 3 phone calls. And so should somebody at the city. And I don't understand why they're stonewalling you. Just incompetence.
Yeah, they also have contracted with Altus and Charter to do all of the jobs. And I suspect that's part of the problem, is that they have chosen to kind of hire 2 companies to take care of everything. But, I will say that there are a couple of shelters that are not run directly by DHS, but are run by nonprofits. One of them is called Bronx Works. And these 2 shelter organizations did fundraising so that they could take care of it themselves. And they told us from the first time somebody walked in until the day it was done and working was a matter of weeks.
Yeah.
So we're sort of looking at, and look, if they're going to go in and overbuild it, sure, it could take 2 years. But it does feel like I'm so gratified to hear what you're saying. There are ways to get this done that will get everybody 95% coverage without having to spend millions and millions and take 8 months to do it. And so, that's a part of our case as well, is like, well, maybe you guys could share some of the information about how you're planning to do this with us, so that we can call you 2 and say, hey, what do you guys think about it? So that we can sort of have our own experts on. But I'm sure, lots of it is it's city contracting. It's dealing with the bureaucracy of New York City. It just, in my heart,
wait a minute. We're in the worst pandemic of our lifetime. The head of the CDC today just said it's probably the worst health emergency the next few months in the history of this nation. City contracting rules have provisions for emergencies, and this is an emergency, and there's really no excuse.
Right.
It really is something. And Altice and Charter, incidentally, have the ability to do just what I said. And if they had a commercial client asking for it, they'd be doing it in weeks.
Well,
they do that routinely.
And that's something that we have talked about a bunch, is like, if when Google came to New York City and rented out a gazillion square feet of commercial space in old, loft, former manufacturing buildings, whatever kind of buildings, do you think they took 8 months? I don't think so.
Of course not.
Done quickly.
Not.
Because it doesn't need much construction. You might occasionally have to drill a hole in the wall, like Charter sends the guy to my apartment, and my box is at the other end of the apartment, and he has to run a cable and drill a hole in the wall in his 2-hour visit. That's the kind of construction we're talking about. It's not kind of thing. Now, Charter has a problem because they're busting the union. And Charter has been locking out the union members for something like a year already.
Yeah.
So they may have a shortage right now. So we should bring in somebody else who is not as resource constrained or incompetent as Charter. Altice has been cutting right and left for years, and they just announced they're going to buy back $2 billion of stock. That's where they're putting the money, not into the people in the field to deliver networks. But if they're the ones in the city contract, the city has the rights under the contract to require performance. You're the attorney on this call. I'm sure you could figure out how to get the requirement of performance under contract into the discussion, or you go to somewhere else, because there are hundreds of outfits in New York, and Stu happens to have run one of them for 20 years, who can do this stuff almost immediately. Why is the city stonewalling you? It's just the people in the legal department don't know the people in the contracting department, and neither of them understand that the technology is not that complicated? Or what is it? Why?
Well, I mean, I think that if you really sort of get down to the fundamental reason why this hasn't happened already, if people living in shelters, if we start with this premise that everyone should be housed, people who wind up in shelters should be there very temporarily in between. Losing an apartment for financial reasons, whatever reasons, and finding somewhere new. When the mayor first came into office, he was committed to basically eliminating homelessness, and doing that by building more affordable housing, developing programs that were going to keep people in their apartments, and if they wound up in shelters, get them out of shelters quickly. And instead, we've got now a shelter population of roughly 60,000 people, 15,000 children sleeping in shelters every night. So, for people to be able in this time to apply for housing, apply for benefits, apply for jobs, you really got to have internet, right? So, I mean, even for kids going to school, this isn't just an issue during the pandemic. Obviously, it's an acute crisis for kids during the pandemic to need access to be able to go to school. But think about what happens the rest of the time. Kids, my kids growing up would come home, they'd play a little video game. They would go online and talk to their friends. They would watch some shows. They'd look at some YouTube stuff. And then they would be online to do their homework, to read the assignments they had to read, to upload stuff, to use Google Classroom, which is, one of the big online platforms that schools use. Parents need the internet to get to the grade systems. My kids had something called Pupil Path, which is like a central system where we could check homework and we could check grades. So it's not even just about those few hours when kids are supposed to be in school. Everybody really needs to have access. And as I've talked to people about this case, most people who aren't kind of in this world of equity can't fathom that there are kids who don't go on the internet because they don't have it, either for fun or for school. But if you think about who the population is that we're talking about, they are poor, they are primarily Black and brown individuals and adults. The families that are living in shelters are particularly, have had particularly difficult experiences with trauma. If nothing before becoming homeless, the experience of becoming homeless is so traumatizing for everyone, and particularly for kids. And so if we sort of think about who in history has ever actually been committed to really looking at the needs of the most vulnerable people in the city, it's just
keep looking.
Keep looking, exactly. And
I've got an answer for that, but Stu's got to interrupt for a station break first.
Okay.
I just want to say that you're listening to Community and Technology on 90.3 WHCR FM, the voice of Harlem. And this is Stu and Dave on Community Technology. When speaking with Susan Horwitz from Legal Aid about lack of internet access for some 60,000 folks living in shelters in New York City. Susan, you mentioned a moment ago that the shelters were designed as transitionary housing. What is that in fact happening, or what's the lifespan for folks living in housing? Is it transitionary, or are folks living there for years?
Yeah, I mean, I think my colleagues in our Homeless Rights Project would absolutely have the numbers and the folks at Coalition for the Homeless. I will tell you that the families that we have been talking with throughout these months are anywhere from 6 months to 2 years in shelter.
Wow.
Some longer. And actually, it's interesting. I had a new attorney starting on our education law team, and he was working with a family in a shelter, and he was very, very deeply affected by the difficulties that this family was facing. And he said, and my God, they've been in a shelter for a year. And I said, I'm really sorry to tell you this, but that's not out of the ordinary for the folks we're working with.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a matter of, stay for a month or two till you get your next apartment. It can be a very, very long time.
Let me answer the question you just asked. Will anybody ever care that actually did something about it? Mayor Bob Wagner and every politician in New York City around 1950, 1960, and probably to 1970. We essentially didn't have homelessness in New York City in 1962. I know that because my mother happened to work for the welfare department. And one day she brought home her notebook and showed how she figured out what the allowance was. And the first item was rent. Whatever it was paid by the city. And then there was an allowance for food, etc., etc. But at that point, the welfare system in New York provided rent and an apartment for everybody in the system by and large. So there may have been some drunks and totally incompetent people who fell through the cracks, but that was the commitment in New York 60 years ago. No homelessness. And it's horrifying to me 60 years later to be having this conversation, although I know everything you say is true.
Would you like to hear how much the city pays for people on public assistance monthly for rent?
I'd like to
I know how much it costs for an apartment in New York.
So for a family with children, family of 3, so let's say a parent and 2 kids, $400.
What?
And so, that gets to really like what that is one of the drivers is that the rates and these amounts are higher in New York City than they are in virtually all of the rest of New York State because the cost of living here is higher. But a family with children of 3 gets $200 twice a month for rent. So, the city still pays directly. And if you live in subsidized housing, if you live in New York City housing, if you have Section 8, it's, it's all based on income. And that can work, but that's what the rate is. It hasn't gone up in, I don't know how many years. I used to do benefits work pretty regularly. And that number has not really changed in quite a long time.
Yeah, that sounds like 1960 rates.
No, in 1950 and 1960, my mother showed me, I was like 12 years old at the time, maybe even a little younger, how what they had to start with the real rent, and that was the number for rent.
Mm-hmm.
It was not some arbitrary $400. And why that's changed is a political question that I don't have expertise on it. But I live in the richest city in the world, and I know we solved homelessness then. And I can't imagine why it's the way it is now.
Well,
that's the reality.
Yeah, I think it's what Susan was saying earlier. It's the political will is not really there. I mean, I think, there's a lot of window dressing and a lot of a hubbub and talk about the commitment, but on a real basis, I don't think the commitment is there.
I think, a lot of us had very high hopes for this administration, coming in on this platform of building affordable housing and eliminating homelessness. And unfortunately, it's only gotten worse.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I kick around with my partner, my tech partner who's not on this call, is, we talk a lot about the amount of money that New York City spends on education. And I think it's $20-some thousand per student per year. Why can't they carve out $1,500 a year for broadband for every student? I mean, that seems like a no-brainer.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it gets to this idea that we have to start looking at broadband as a utility. Mm-hmm. And not as this thing that only people who can afford it can get. And the mayor announced the big settlement in the Verizon case last week. And that's great, but people in shelters cannot call up Verizon or call up Charter or Altice and go, hey, you're giving free internet for a few months during the pandemic. Come and wire my unit. So, these sort of bigger picture things are great for lots of people, but people living in shelters don't have any control over what can be brought in into their particular unit. So that was a little frustrating, because I know that I spoke to a few people who said, oh, that's great about your case in the Verizon settlement. And I said, that's had absolutely nothing to do with it.
And that's a mistake they're making in Washington. Besides the fact that most of the problem is not the fewer areas that can't get service, spending $20 billion building new facilities takes years. We have the facilities in place everywhere in New York City, and the wireless networks now, the last 2 or 3 years, it's really changed. The wireless networks have enough capacity, although they can't get through all the walls. Now, T-Mobile actually has a solution for that. They put a little box in the window, and it's a repeater, and it probably would solve most of those problems if they put them in. But the technology is, which is what I know, is there routinely to do this every day. Now, how you solve and the cost is low enough that that's not the issue. How you solve the political problems, you're the expert on that, not me.
Well, it's not just political, but Dave, something that you know better than both of us is the pricing and the economic scheme that we live under, where you have these multi-billion-dollar providers like Verizon making billions and billions of dollars a year, and yet if you try and get them to do any kind of giveaway to poor folks, it's like pulling teeth. And, we have some of the highest pricing on the planet. Dave, you can speak to this, and you have on previous shows, some of the highest pricing on the planet compared to places like Europe and Asia for broadband. And, the government does nothing to regulate that. And the corporations are just looking out for their stockholders.
Well, this one is pretty much an exception. T-Mobile really is connecting. They're connecting millions. I didn't know New York City was in the thing. We had Senator Sepulveda on, and he didn't know that New York City had this kind of thing ability. He was complaining how they couldn't get any of these connections in the Bronx. So some of it is that Board of Ed may very well have a deal with T-Mobile, and I know T-Mobile is actually doing it because doesn't cost them anything. The wireless technologies move so fast, they're loaded with capacity. They have more capacity than they can sell. So hooking up a few other people just doesn't add up to hell of beans. But it's just incredibly frustrating to me, because I know how this can be done. Stu knows, and there's a whole lot of people who work for New York City who know. And shouldn't even, there's no reason they couldn't do this in 6 weeks whenever they decided to do it.
I was just gonna ask Susan, what's the status of the lawsuit? I mean, do folks have to respond to you within a time frame, or where are there pressure points? What's going on?
So the status is we filed last week. We are expecting a response at the end of this week. And we are discussing, we filed an injunction along with the complaint, which means that things sort of get expedited. And it's interesting that you mentioned 6 weeks. When we filed last week, which was the day before Thanksgiving, the 23rd, 2 days before, we said we expect this to be done by January 4th, which is the first day back to school after the school break, which is about
and there may be
right?
two of the 50 buildings they can't do by January 4th. There sometimes are technical problems, but you can basically
over
do the job.
Buildings, but remember, so here's one of the most frustrating parts of this. I don't have the number in front of me, but a number of the shelters are commercial hotels. And I think, everybody's familiar with the situation with the Lucerne on the Upper West Side. That's an example. It's a commercial hotel that was doing no business and entered into a contract with the city to serve as a temporary shelter. And anybody who's been in a hotel, even a Motel 6 in the last 15 years knows that they're cabled, they're wired, there's Wi-Fi, but they won't turn them on. I have to assume it's because that's not part of the payment. But my question is, wait a second, that should be the easy answer. If I was getting sued on this and I was a city, I would be. Maybe they are reaching out to the hotel providers. We don't know because we don't have any information. But I'd be calling them immediately and saying, flip the damn switch. I heard about a hotel, and actually someone else I spoke to had heard about the same situation. I don't know which hotel it is, but apparently there's one in Queens near LaGuardia that has 2 separate buildings. One building still is commercial, and there are people coming through when they've got, flights, waiting for flights. And then the other building is serving as a shelter, but it's the same hotel. And the bill, guess which one has Wi-Fi?
Gee, I don't know. Gee.
Well, they have somebody who's making the Wi-Fi work in one building, and that same somebody knows how to make the Wi-Fi work in both.
Yeah.
And the Lucerne is one of the ugliest things in my life, and I grew up on 83rd Street, 4 blocks away from it. That's a horrible story.
It's been so heartbreaking for so many people, and for all of us at Legal Aid, particularly the folks in our Homeless Rights Project. It's been devastating to see what the city has become. I didn't grow up here. I've been here for 35 years. And the things that I've loved about New York were close to being destroyed by that situation. And the similar one that's happening in Tribeca, as the folks at the Lucerne are imminently going to be moved. What happened? When did the city become, well, obviously I'm speaking rhetorically, but
the Times picked up that some of these battles are the same as they were Giuliani versus Dinkins. And Giuliani became mayor by race-baiting Dickens.
right.
And I remember that one well. Question, has Maya Wiley played any role in your work here?
We have not heard from, I don't think that we have heard, but neither have we done specific outreach to kind of solicit support or responses from political folks.
Maya Wiley was an aide to the mayor for years, and she was actually an important progressive in telecom policy nationwide. She actually intervened in an FCC proceeding where the Verizon was trying to take away some of the Wi-Fi bandwidth that they're using for that PC link. And she was one of the very few people who spoke up about it. She's now running for mayor. I personally support her, although I don't know how much I'm allowed to say on the radio show beyond that. But there is a whole lot of goodwill. I don't think you are on the, yeah.
I
Go
think
ahead.
what tends to happen is we, certainly in my practice with the education stuff and maybe not as much with some of my colleagues who move more quickly to suing. We really try to negotiate and try to work stuff out and try to convince whoever needs to be convinced to do what they need to do. But there is a point at which it became clear with this situation that the city was going to do nothing unless we threatened to sue them, and then ultimately sued them. And at first the DOE was, the folks that they had made their point people on this issue were really incredibly responsive. I give them props. There were two people in particular who were very responsive, but there was nothing they could do once they found out from their, one of these folks called me and said, listen, the tech guy just said they can't do anything because it's about reception. So I have noticed though, on Twitter when we've, posted things about the case, the amount of support from lots of different spheres has been really remarkable. I don't know that there's anyone who, actually I did see one troll on Twitter just this week said, what a colossal waste of money, go to the library. And of course I avoided saying, what library? They're not open. Although some of the public libraries were keeping their Wi-Fi signals on so that people could be outside of libraries, which was fantastic. But there's no there's no argument on the other side of this. Like, what is an argument possibly going to be? No, we're not responsible for making sure kids can attend school when they're living under our roofs.
Just briefly tell us, what is the legal underpinning for, I know in one of the stories I read that the city or federal and state law guarantee access to an education. Exactly, just kind of briefly tie that together with your lawsuit for us.
Sure, so the legal theory on this case is that under New York state law and the New York State Constitution, at the state level, there is a guarantee of the right to an education. There was a court case, actually, we were talking about education spending in the city. There was a court case for years that still has never been resolved, that was brought by the Campaign for Fiscal Equity, that alleged successfully that New York State had basically been ripping off New York City for many years in terms of the amount of school aid that had been provided. And within that case, it very clearly says that the state constitution provides this right to a robust education to students. So at the same time, there's also the McKinney-Vento Act, which is the federal law that guarantees children who are in temporary housing with the right to a number of different educational benefits. For example, if a family is living in East Harlem, becomes homeless, and is placed in a shelter in the Bronx, the kids get to remain at the school that they had attended when they were in an apartment. And the idea is that if there's one thing we can do for kids, it's school stability. As I said before, the trauma, the upheaval of losing your home, at least let's let kids stay in the school that they know, if they want to. Certainly for some of our clients, the families are very happy to get out of the schools that they've been in and try somewhere else. But because McKinney-Vento specifically says that the school district is required to remove barriers to education for students in temporary housing. We are, one of our claims is that under that federal law, the city, the only way that kids right now are able to go to school is by being on the internet, being online. And so in order to provide an education to students, they have to provide access to the internet. So it's pretty straightforward. We talk about the virtual schoolroom and locked out of the virtual schoolroom. If kids can't walk into a school building, and this is the only way for them to be educated, then the city really has to provide the means to do that. One issue that has come up also is around families who have chosen to, until a couple of weeks ago, chosen to send their kids to school for some days of in-person learning and some days of remote learning, as opposed to families who chose fully remote learning. And what we have found is every one of the families who we spoke to about this case, not just the 3 that are named plaintiffs, but everyone else we've spoken to, they have all chosen to keep their kids home. And, the reason why is that we're talking about people who are members of the, super vulnerable community, who have all lost people. And many of our clients are single parent households. And there's a real legitimate fear that if the kids come home having been exposed, somebody's going to get sick, and Lord knows what's going to happen to the family at that point. So I don't expect that anyone would say, well, they could just have chosen to go to school a few days. But that's also a real issue. Like, there's really no choice for many of our families. And we've got lots of kids and lots of parents who have medical conditions and vulnerabilities. And to have to choose between sending your kid to school at the risk of exposure because you can't get on the internet, and staying home, your kid not getting any school, and potentially getting a call from child welfare folks about why isn't your kid in school. These are impossible problems on top of all the stresses.
Well, this is really important work that you're doing, Susan. I applaud you for your work and encourage you to stay at it. We're just about out of time. Is there any particular point or issue you'd like to mention that we haven't discussed?
I think we've really covered a lot. Thank you so much for asking me on. It's really fascinating talking with you and with Dave about your sense, which is our sense, that this should not take so long. And, this is a huge crisis. We're talking about kids that already, by virtue of living in shelters, they already are facing all these obstacles to really getting good, solid educations. And this is just going to make that all the more difficult.
Okay, well, it looks like we lost Dave, but I'd like to, on behalf of him and myself, thank you for coming on this show very much. Really important stuff to share with our audience.
Thank you so much.
And hopefully maybe you can come back in sometime in January, let us know what the status is, give us an update.
Hopefully it will be good news.
Okay, I'm counting on it. Okay, thank you. We're going to talk about Susan Horwitz from Legal Aid about technology accessibility in homeless shelters. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you so much.
Okay, this is Community and Technology signing off till next week. Thanks for tuning in. WHCR 90.3 FM.